Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to yet another phenomenally interesting video on disorders. Today we are talking about mood disorders, specifically two mood disorders, major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. We're going to look at those two, the symptoms and causes of them, and also think a lot about just in general the sort of psychological underpinnings of mood disorders and of depression specifically. Why does it happen genetically? Biologically, psychologically, so on and so forth. Let's do it. In general, when we're talking about mood disorders, before we even start thinking about specific disorders, it's nice to think in general about depression, which relates to these disorders a lot. What the heck do we mean when we say depression? We all have heard this term. We all know what it, we all use it. We know, like, if someone says, I'm so depressed right now, you know what they're talking about. But the way psychologists understand it might be a little bit different. So in general, let's look at sort of the prevalence of depression first. According to surveys, for example, 29% of high school students have reported feeling so sad or hopeless in the last year that they would stop doing certain activities for days at a time. Similarly, almost a third, 31% of college students said that in the last year they'd felt so depressed that it was difficult for them to function. So I share these stats with you just to demonstrate that depression is extremely widespread. In fact, as you can see at the bottom there, it is the #1 reason why an American will seek counseling, will go to a psychiatrist and say, I need help, because they are struggling with depression. Before we talk about all the ways that depression can be bad, I want to frame out and show you guys that it can be a good thing too. I included sadness from Inside Out here because, semi-spoiler alert, if you've seen the movie, you know that by the end of it, sadness isn't really a bad character. You are taught throughout the movie that there are actually a lot of good things associated with sadness and ways that sadness can help you and be good for you in some ways. And that's very true psychologically. Sometimes feeling a little depressed is an appropriate response to whatever's happening in your life. If you have a loss in your life or a tragedy, if someone close to you passes away, it's normal to feel sad for a little bit and to deal with that. That doesn't mean you have a psychological disorder. It means you're a human being. And there's reasons why we feel depressed, good reasons why. For example, if you again have a tragedy, you're struggling with a loss, one way you might respond to that is to become aggressive, to lash out at others. Depression makes it less likely that you will do so. Depression slows you down. It calms the nervous system in a lot of ways. It forces you to look inward, to reflect, to think a lot. And while that can be bad in a lot of ways, if those thoughts are not great, there are some benefits to that reflection. That reflection can restrain you from being unreasonable. It can keep you from being, I guess, what you might call an egomaniac, setting unreasonable goals and taking unreasonable risks. Depression can be a safeguard against that. It can keep you from lashing out, from being aggressive in ways that will get you into more trouble with others around you. Like I said, it enhances reflection. And interestingly enough, depression can improve your memory. It can improve your recall ability. Studies have shown that people who are feeling a little blue have better memory than those who are feeling just totally 100% great about themselves. And part of the reason for this, again, psychologists hypothesize, is because of that sort of self-reflective nature of depression. But what happens when depression becomes a bad thing? Major depressive disorder, again, one of the most common disorders you will find in the DSM-5. Major depressive disorder is what happens when depression becomes maladaptive, when depression starts to prevent you from living a normal life. So you have all these signs of depression here on the right, all of these symptoms. If you have these signs, a few of these signs lasting 2 or more weeks without stopping, that is when you have major depressive disorder. Again, we've all had bad days when we feel a little down for the day. We've all had days when we feel really tired, right? We all have had problems sometimes with guilt or feeling bad about ourselves at some point in our life. that doesn't mean that you have major depressive disorder. If these things are constantly on your mind, you cannot shake them, you're just always down for 2 weeks at a time, straight, no break, that is when you have major depressive disorder. And major depressive disorder is the first of the major mood disorders we'll talk about. The second one is related, but sort of adds a layer on top to major depressive disorder, and that's bipolar disorder. So bipolar disorder is when you toggle back and forth, you flip back and forth between two extremes on the spectrum of mood. The first extreme is depression. And again, looking at these same symptoms when we're talking about depression, okay? You flip though, you don't constantly in this depressed state. You also will flip back and forth to what's called a manic state in which you experience mania. Mania is a hyperactive, a wildly optimistic state. You are going crazy. Someone who's manic seems to be the most joyful, intense, high energy person that you have ever met if they're experiencing this manic state. But that is countered then by falling back into depression. Interestingly, between 1990 and 2003, we saw a 40-fold increase. That is a 4,000% increase in the diagnoses of bipolar disorder among teenagers in the United States. Part of this might be because it's actually happening more, but again, if you think back to our discussion and our debate about the DSM-5 that we did last week, part of this also may be because of changing definitions of bipolar disorder and changing cultural perceptions and thinking about bipolar disorder that might have contributed to this trend in increased diagnosis. Mania, while it is maladaptive and it will prevent you from living a normal life, there are some benefits to mania. There have been some great creative figures throughout history who have demonstrated signs of mania. Mark Twain, the author, is thought to have struggled with mania throughout his life. A lot of people might say Kanye West is a manic guy. It does have some, if you're a creative person already, mania can lead to sort of great outbursts in, creative energy and creative output. So here, this is an example of a person with bipolar disorder, not a real person, but it's a really good illustrative example from the movie Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? This guy who you're going to see running around with the machine gun is an example of a patient with mania.
In 2 hours. Okay, folks, hold your applause and drop your drawers. I'm George Nelson, and I'm here to set the city eat a peanut.
He's a live wire, though, ain't he?
All the money in a bag. What are you looking at, Grandpa?
Pardon me, George. You got a plan for getting out of here?
Sure, boys. Here's my plan. They ain't never seen ordinance like this. Thank you, folks. And remember, Jesus saves, but George Nelson withdraws. Go fetch the order back, Pete. Who said that? What ignorant, low down, slanderizing son of a bitch said that? My name is George Nelson. Get me?
She didn't mean nothing by it, George.
George Nelson, not Babyface. You remember, and you tell your friends, I'm George Nelson, born to raise hell.
So notice at the end there, you saw the flip from mania at the start to what is the start of depression, this lethargy that you see. See, his shoulders are slumped. He's got no more energy. He's becoming very sort of morose. That is the toggle between mania and depression that a bipolar patient undergoes. One important note about this is that it doesn't always have to be, like in this case, it was caused by that woman saying something that he didn't like. There doesn't always need to be a reason to flip between mania and depression. It just happens without much of an environmental cause that you could observe in most patients. So some key points just to circle back on these about depression before we move on. It's widespread. Most depressive episodes do not need treatment or help. They will sort of play themselves out and end on their own. That does depend on your environment. So if you are in a supportive, healthy environment, it's much more likely that a depressive episode will end on its own. If you are not in one of those environments, depressive episodes are more likely to carry on. They're often preceded, again, this is just kind of common sense, by stressful life events. If you are having some issues at work, or if you have a loss in your life, it's very often that will the case that will trigger depression. And one interesting thing about depression too is that it continues to onset earlier with each generation. In other words, we see people in each generation, the signs of people starting to develop depression happen sooner and sooner and sooner. And there's a lot of different thinking about why this might be happening among psychologists. Does it have to do with changes in our culture and sort of our culture's focus and values on different things? Does it have to do with, again, just changes to the DSM-5 or other versions of the DSM? We're not sure. A lot of people think today, for example, that sort of the family has become less, like the family, quote unquote, the family unit has become less important, but we still are very, as a culture and society, we still prize individualism a lot. So that sort of makes people feel isolated. They don't feel like they have a strong support network, and that leads to more depression. These are all just theories, though. We don't have any scientific fact boosting any of this. Let's think about some causes of depression. The first one being genes. This is a chart showing heritability. And again, heritability is the extent to which differences among individuals can be attributed to genes. So if you look at bipolar disorder here, extremely heritable. 85% or so of the differences in occurrences of bipolar disorder among a population of people can be attributed to genes. So very heritable bipolar disorder. Major depressive disorder, not quite so much. Less than 40% of the differences of this occurrence can be attributed to genes. So there's that, of course, then tells you that there are environmental factors and some other sort of individual psychological things at play causing this issue. A big cause of depression is what you'll hear referred to as quote unquote chemical imbalance in the brain. And generally speaking, when we're talking about chemical imbalance, we are talking about neurotransmitters. Problems with neurotransmitters and issues with neurotransmitters not functioning the way they should is a very frequently causes depression. And this video is going to take you through that a little bit more. The first part will be just a review, sort of how does neuron to neuron communication work, and then in the second half they'll talk about specifically how this affects depression.
Depression is one of the most common psychiatric disorders. Symptoms of depression are often subtle and unrecognized by both patients and physicians. The brain contains a network of interconnected nerve cells called neuron. The junction between the neurons is called the synaptic junction. The transmission of impulses from one neuron to another is facilitated by chemicals called neurotransmitters. The impulse triggers the release of neurotransmitters from one neuron, which cross the synaptic junction and attach themselves to the receptors in the adjacent neuron, sending the message through. Later, the neurotransmitter returns to the initial neuron via the reuptake channel. One of the causes of depression is believed to be the depletion of the amine neurotransmitters serotonin and norepinephrine. Antidepressant drugs increase the availability of neurotransmitters at the synaptic junction by blocking the reuptake channel.
So there you have it. Reuptake being messed around with by antidepressant drugs, which again include things like Xanax, for example. In addition, there are some physical non-neurotransmitter related causes. If you have depression, we will often see decreased activity in the left frontal lobe. We will also see that part of the brain will actually be a little bit smaller than normal, interestingly enough. Like if you just physically hold it in your hand, it'll be a little bit smaller than a typical frontal lobe. In a bipolar patient, they have less white matter in their brain. The ratio of white matter to gray matter is off. Here's some interesting brain scans as well to further kind of illustrate this point. So this is brain scans of a bipolar patient as they toggle between depression and mania, as you can see. So the hotter the color in this brain scan, the more brain activity is happening. In other words, this deep blue means like no brain activity. This dark red means a lot of brain activity. And so you can see there's literally a lot less brain activity happening when you're depressed than when you are manic. That brain is lighting up when you're manic and then falling again into depression. This again is demonstrating sort of depression slows you down. It depresses literally your nervous system and your body's functioning. So a couple other ways to think about the causes of depression, more sort of in a psychological standpoint. One issue that we have with depression is that people who are depressed tend to ruminate on their issues. Rumination is overthinking about your problems and their causes. We've all kind of had this experience of just dwelling on something bothering you until it builds up in your mind and gets worse and worse and worse and just cycles back on you. And after a while, you've made it up in your mind into something that it really isn't. That's rumination. Related to that is we have this sort of decision-making tree that demonstrates the difference between a depressed person and a healthy person. So for example, we have this outside stimulus. You break up with your boyfriend or your girlfriend. If you are depressed, you are more likely to follow this left-hand side line of thinking. If you are not depressed, you are more likely to follow this right-hand side of thinking. And this is getting into the cognitive effects of depression. So again, you can see here, I break up with my boyfriend or girlfriend. If I'm depressed, I'm gonna say, oh, I'll never get over this. I will never feel better. And then that starts to build. Without my partner, I can't do anything right. It's all my fault. As you ruminate on these issues, you get further and further into depression. Whereas if you have this line of thinking, like, look, this is awful right now, but I'm going to get through it. I'm going to be better for it at the end. You have sort of this second path, which is much more healthy. And the sort of thoughts you are having here allow you to be more successful in coping with this life event and not fall into depression. Last but not least, another way to think about what causes depression, this is also part of rumination, is the cycle that we go through, which starts with physical stuff, moves through psychological issues, and ends in behaviors that then feeds back into physical. So you start off, you're tired, you don't have energy, maybe you're gaining or losing weight. That's a physical start. That's leading to thoughts, right, that are mirroring those physical symptoms. Everything is awful, it's all pointless, I hate my life, I'm not happy, ruminating on these things. Of course, those thoughts that you're having, those ruminations, are going to lead to some negative emotions. You're going to get irritable, upset, not feel happy, as a result of this sort of rumination that we see happening moving through here. And then that negative feeling is going to obviously lead to negative behaviors, sleeping more, avoiding people, so on and so forth. And then interestingly enough, though, those behaviors will feed back into physical symptoms that starts the process all over again. If you're sleeping all the time, you're actually more likely to feel tired, right? You've probably had a day where you stayed in bed like all day. You didn't feel refreshed by dinner time. You felt just lazy and lethargic because you hadn't gotten your body up and moving. And then that cycle just continues around and around and around. So that is it for mood disorders. Make sure, as always, you post a question on your Google Classroom. Looking forward to talking about with you guys more in class mañana.